Okay, well, let's get started. Um, Thank you everybody for joining this webinar. We are extremely proud of all the work that a lot of the team has done to get IRP CoLab publicly launched. As of earlier this week, the public website is available. There's lots of great resources there, and our first webinar, we've got a fantastic panel to talk all things resource planning. The the motivation for the CoLab really has been that the legacy resource planning framework has sort of struggled as we've got high load growth, affordability is an issue, the complexity of modeling, stakeholder engagement. There's a lot of things that have challenged the legacy framework of resource planning, and CoLab's sort of initiative was to bring a lot of different people and their perspectives into a common framework, bring about best practices that Aaron's going to talk about in a minute, and just really make sure that we are meeting the challenge of the moment. So with that, I will kick this off to Aaron, and he will present one of our big deliverables from CoLab. So Aaron, you have the floor. You can take the screen.
All right. Thank you so much, Nikhil. Am I coming through?
Yes.
Great. Let me get my presentation started here. All right. That should be coming through. Well, first off, thank you for the introduction, Nikhil. And thank you everyone for joining this afternoon. My name is Aaron Schwartz. I'm a senior engineer at Telos Energy. And along with GridLab and RMI, I'm really excited to be supporting the launch of IRP CoLab and this first of several deliverables that you can now find on the IRP CoLab website, which is the IRP Best Practice Rubric and Reference Guide. So Nikhil already mentioned a little bit of some of the motivation around IRP CoLab. But I couldn't help put this in context of Bad Bunny's amazing Super Bowl performance earlier this year, where there's this really memorable part of the performance where he's standing on top of a utility feeder and there's sparks flying and he's dancing, on top of the pole. And I can see some analogies between this and what resource planning is going on right now. First is there's just so many new moves to master. IRP is becoming more complex, driven by evolving policy, load growth from large loads like data centers, vehicle electrification, and so on. That it's really just challenging what I think for a long time has been a more incremental process where there are defined methods, defined methodologies. That's all starting to change as uh, the complexity increases. There's also a lot of noise. The Super Bowl is a notoriously loud place. And in a similar way, there's so many different new methods, new tools, new expectations that it can be difficult to prioritize from among those. Um, and just like the Super Bowl, I think the most watched sporting event in the country, right now all eyes are in on utilities and resource planning in the face of rising rates, in the face of large load growth. So the spotlight's on us to really make sure that we can do this right and do this correctly and in a way that's fair, equitable to ratepayers and really all stakeholders involved in the process. So that sort of was the motivation behind the rubric. And what we're hoping that it can support are three main outcomes. First is to prioritize planning outcomes that planners want from IRP. The second is to help planners articulate those outcomes clearly and effectively. And finally is to empower them to pursue specific and actionable planning practices that are the most essential for realizing those outcomes. So reflecting how much is changing, reflecting the added complexity, really help distill that and help navigate this landscape in a way that makes sense given the unique circumstances that different planners are facing in different jurisdictions. So I wanted to zoom out just for a minute here and just give a quick overview of the process that led to this report. It involved two workshops. So the first back in 2024 of really evaluating the different needs and identifying, having a clear rubric as one opportunity that we thought could move planning forward. This is with the IRP CoLab advisory group. From there, we did a literature review deep dive, starting with some of the great literature put out by Synapse, LBNL, RMI, eSig, and more, that have already laid the foundation to a lot of the best practices that we're talking about today. And went through a process of working to prioritize these as well as identify examples. So we reviewed nearly 20 IRPs and other relevant academic and industry literature. We worked closely with the IRP advisory group, the IRP CoLab advisory group, along with the specific advisors for this report, Sylvan Energy Analytics and Resilient Transition. And we're able to bring a draft to a second workshop this past September, where we got additional feedback, review, and brought that all, integrated it into the final report that you see. So I just want to give a big shout out. What we're going to be talking through, and hopefully you can review at the report, has been a big effort with a lot of amazing feedback from several organizations and individuals. The report is laid out across three key phases of the IRP modeling process. Those are scenario design, portfolio design, and portfolio evaluation. And these are kind of like the essential ingredients that belong in every resource plan. So for scenario design, IRP should start with foundation of meaningful scenarios. These are a collection of inputs and assumptions that represent different ways the future could unfold, and are kind of like the bread and butter for resource planning and allowing planners to explore the future and uncertainty. Mostly these are considering factors beyond the control of a planner, whether that's different load growth scenarios, different technology availability, and of course, much more. Once we have a solid foundation of scenarios, we move on to developing portfolios that can respond to the unique characteristics of those scenarios while ensuring that the portfolio can meet any expected load growth with the supply and demand side resources that's being considered by the model. And of course, in a way that is reliable. Capacity expansion models are the most commonly used in this step. But of course, the portfolio design can be informed by a wide variety of planning tools. The final phase is portfolio evaluation. So through the portfolio design step, we will have identified one or several portfolios that could be different candidates or respond to different potential futures. And we want to evaluate their performance. How do they do on reliability? How do they do on cost? How do they do on policy objectives? For example, emissions reduction or other public policy goals. And overall, really being able to assess them across key metrics. And of course, as you can see on the left, throughout all phases of the IRP process, a robust stakeholder process is really important for thoughtful consideration of feedback throughout these steps. So one of the things that we recognized very quickly when putting together this rubric was that different planners in different jurisdictions, different parts of the country, can be facing very different specific challenges to their planning process. And so we identified what we call planning challenges. We found 6 of them that we think are fairly common or increasingly common among different planners. These are coal plant retirements, uncertainty around data center load growth, climate and weather uncertainty, state decarbonization requirements, high electrification, and resource constraints. That is, for example, constraints on land availability, on potentially supply chain constraints, and the like. we wanted to lay out these planning challenges to really help give readers of the report a way of identifying quickly, hey, this really resonates with the challenges that I'm going through in my specific jurisdiction, and then to be able to prioritize the specific best practices that could be most relevant. So this is a list of the 14 best practice areas that are featured in the report. And you can see on each column are the 6 planning challenges. The idea being, and you can see each dot represents the alignment of planning challenge and best practice area that we think are the most relevant. This makes it easily navigable so that you can quickly open up the report, say, hey, I'm someone who's really interested in navigating uncertainty around data center load growth, for example. And so I'm going to focus my attention on the specific best practice areas that are represented by these green dots. And actually, if you go into the report, these are hyperlinks, and you can click on the green dot, and it'll take you directly to that specific best practice area. So today, because we are limited on time, I'm just going to highlight 3 of these, one from those each of those 3 key IRP phases. And those are developing a wide range of scenarios and sensitivities, considering transmission costs and constraints and capacity expansion modeling, and evaluating portfolios using RA backchecks and deterministic stress testing. So on the previous slide, you noticed 14 distinct best practice areas. These are fairly broad, and there's multiple ways that an IRP can achieve them. And what we call those different options are implementation options, recognizing that there can be multiple ways or multiple approaches, methodologies that could sort of check the box and meet that best practice. This was something that we worked really closely with different the advisors from IRP CoLab in figuring out how we might categorize these. And here's where we landed. So first is recognize that for some of these implementation options, they are mutually exclusive and relational. So good, better, best. This is also circumstantial. So these all involve trade-offs. And the best approach that offers the most detail and accuracy also likely involves greater computational data requirements or just time in order to achieve that. So just because something is labeled best here doesn't necessarily mean it's going to be the right fit for every planner, but rather this is a way of helping evaluate those trade-offs. And in cases, for example, where one of the best practice areas is aligned with one of those specific planning challenges, maybe that's worth the additional data collection. Maybe that's worth the additional computation to get that additional data and accuracy to form effective planning. But if it's on the rubric, we think it's a reasonable approach that can meet the need. We also have complementary options that are distinct options to fulfill a best practice area, but they're not relationally better or worse than other options. So we'll see a few examples of those. And finally, emerging options that highlight emerging methodologies that show promise to advance meaningful improvements in planning, but may not be widely widespread right now. So let's jump into a few of these examples. So the first is developing a wide range of scenarios and sensitivities to explore near and long-term uncertainty. You can see on the upper right-hand corner, these glyphs represent each of those 6 planning challenges. This applies to all 6 of them. This is foundational to effective planning. And here we have 2 options. So these are the complementary options. Planners can choose one or both of these. They can be mixed and matched. They're not relational, better or worse. Both of these are valid approaches that can be done either individually or together. So option 1 is developing multiple scenarios that can reflect internally consistent assumptions to explore key uncertainties. Again, this is just one of these foundational elements that I'm looking for whenever I'm looking at an IRP. Salt River Project in their 2023 IRP has a great visual of the different factors that they are assessing, for example, economic growth, temperature increase, carbon policy, and so on, and how those vary across the different scenarios that they're evaluating. And they have 4 primary scenarios that they are considering in the IRP. The best practice rubric features lots and lots and lots of examples from resource plans from utilities across the country. And so if you go in, you can see more detail, you can see additional examples. The second implementation option is to model high and low bookend sensitivities for key uncertainties, such as load forecasts or fuel prices, to really help get a sense of what is the range of potential futures. And when assessing research portfolios that may be developed under those bookends, what looks similar, what looks different? How confident might we be in these different futures? For example, if costs are similar or the portfolios look similar, that can give a lot of confidence that we can move forward with those investments. If there's a lot of divergence, that means maybe we want to take a step back and assess really what's driving those differences and how likely those different futures might be. Next up is considering transmission costs and constraints in capacity expansion modeling. And we have three options here. Number one, this is what we consider the best option, is to allow endogenous economic expansion of zonal transfer capabilities in capacity expansion modeling. And we highlight an example here on the left of PacifiCorp in their 2021 and 2023 IRP of allowing their capacity expansion model to select transmission upgrades as a selectable resource, along with other supply side resources such as new generation. Another option is option number two of applying transmission cost adders directly to new resources to capture network upgrade costs, integrated into the cost that the model sees for a specific resource. So this isn't quite as closely coupled as the model being able to select transmission upgrades directly, but is a more indirect way of representing those costs. And option number three, one of these complementary options that can be done along with either of the others, is evaluating pre-selected transmission planning scenarios as candidates in the capacity expansion model. So especially if there's a specific transmission line that is under development or under evaluation, this can be a useful way of zeroing in and looking at the specific economic or reliability impacts of that investment. Final best practice to highlight is evaluating portfolios using RA backchecks and deterministic stress testing. So this is in the portfolio evaluation stage. We already have several candidate portfolios, and we want to take a look. Are they reliable under probabilistic scenarios? Are they reliable under specific stress events? The first of these options looks at those specific stress events. So we can take, for example, a historic winter storm or summer heat wave and evaluate specifically how do these portfolios perform under those specific meteorological conditions. Second option here is to perform RA back checks of running portfolios that maybe come from the capacity expansion model through a probabilistic resource adequacy model, looking at a wide variety of probabilistic evaluations under a diverse set of weather, outage, load conditions. And the final example is one of these emerging options of actually iterating between capacity expansion and RA models by adjusting certain parameters. On the left is an example of this in practice from the CPUC, where they iterate between their resolved capacity expansion model and SERVM resource adequacy model, making adjustments as needed to their resource portfolio until it meets the reliability standard, the 1 day and 10-year criterion. So this is just a small subset of the best practices in the report. There's a lot more detail. There's many, many examples. So we hope you check it out. I wanted to just close by some reflections and lessons learned from embarking on this process. The first is that examples of planning innovations abound. And it was very inspiring looking through many, many IRPs through industry literature on just the advancements that are taking place across the phases of the process, really among utilities across the countries. And so that was really inspiring and encouraging. Second is that disagreement is an opportunity for discussion. So there were a lot of great discussions and feedback and disagreement as we tried to rank and prioritize and down select across best practices. And I think that's exciting and really what this is about. practices will continue to evolve. The resource planning landscape will continue to change. And not everyone might agree on what best is or what better is or what the different options are, the right options are for different circumstances. We think that by laying them out in this clear way as a rubric, it can start those conversations and hopefully guide planners in the right direction. And then finally is that IRP CoLab is here to offer helping hands. As you can see on the right, please check our new website. We want to work together with you. We want to hear your feedback. So we're really excited to be here for this official launch. It's been a long time in the making. And I want to thank you all for joining to be part of it. So that's what I've got. Nikhil, I will turn it back over to you.
Thanks so much, Aaron. That was fantastic, and yeah, you've lived and breathed this document, and I agree with you. I mean, the diversity of resource planning, looking at all these different IRPs, sort of gives you a perspective of like one, all the challenges that different utilities are facing, and two, yeah, I mean, they're innovating some more than others. So, I would welcome our panel now, and we've pasted their bios in the chat, so you can see, we've got really and a wide range of expertise on this panel. So let me kick things off, maybe first with Dr. Nidhi Santan from EPRI, and get her first reflection. What resonated with you from the presentation that Aaron just gave on the best practices rubric? And, from your vantage point at EPRI, where you work with a lot of different utilities and other stakeholders, which methodologies you think are useful for utility IRPs, and resource planning in general?
Yeah, thank you, Nikhil, and thanks, Aaron, for the great presentation, also for having me today. Um, I'll try to be quick because I know we have a great panel, but I have to say, Aaron, like all of the points that you just made in terms of scenario development, co-optimization of G&T and portfolio evaluation, and methods for doing so are important and resonated with me in terms of like where I sit at EPRI. I'll say, scenario development so important. Complexity seems to be, of course, ever growing. The range of uncertainties follows that ever growing space. And an issue for planners, planners that are actually facing right now is probably having too many uncertainties. So what I'll say is I might just add to the best practice that you set out, which is very good, in that, having an approach to kind of sift through all of the different uncertainties to create representative uncertainties is something that's on a lot of planners' minds. But you absolutely have to start from the best practice of, making sure that you have the range of uncertainties that you want to consider in the first place. That's definitely important. Integrated system planning is likely going to replace traditional IRP sooner or later. I know everyone's sort of on a different journey, in terms of the industry and where they are on that. But co-optimizing generation and transmission often tends to be, among the first steps that utilities want to take when they're thinking about their journey in ISP. So I think that one is so important. And then finally, portfolio evaluation. I think that, portfolio decision making under uncertainty is probably still the coolest kid on the block when it comes to IRP and ISP. There's a lot of different ways to consider investment decision making under uncertainty. Many of those methods still feel maybe computationally intractable. That might change with the onset of like AI and advanced computational methods, but I'll just say having the capability to do kind of what you described there in terms of probabilistic evaluation of candidate portfolios is a really important step in identifying, robust portfolios and thinking about uncertainty. So, yeah, all of them are great. Thanks so much.
Thanks, Nidhi. I'm going to cut back to you because you've got an additional sort of workload of looking at data center flexibility. So we'll come back to that at EPRI. But maybe I'll ask a question to Ryan next. Ryan, maybe first, if you could give, a background on community choice aggregators themselves, given your background, and, you're distinct from like traditional vertically integrated utilities that, a lot of the IRPs that we deal with, work with. And so, how does your approach in resource planning differ, or how do you think about resource planning, given your community choice aggregator background?
Yeah, no, thank you, Nikhil. Really appreciate being invited here. Great to hear all the great stuff that Aaron's putting out there in the world today. Yeah, so community choice aggregations, CCAs, your retail service providers that are formed by local jurisdictions in California to procure energy resources and provide customer programs that kind of are aligned with those local jurisdictions' values and needs. There's over 25 of us now. I think we actually represent approaching 40% of the load in the IOU territory. So we are, a driving force in California, especially when you're thinking about clean energy build out. I think the load has been departing from the IOUs, going to the CCAs, resulting into the CCAs playing the predominant role in building a lot of the clean resources we have on the grid today. In the context of resource planning, so CCAs, I think, first kind of got involved in resource planning back in 2015. California passed legislation that set up a requirement that CCAs create IRPs and submit those to the Public Utilities Commission. I think the first iteration of that for a lot of CCAs was sort of a compliance exercise. It was a way for the PUC to be able to check that load serving entities were planning the types of resources that are needed to meet the state's GHG targets. But I think the many CCAs, including Sonoma Clean Power, we've matured into viewing IRPs as more than just a compliance exercise, but an effective tool for making strategic portfolio decisions, and also signaling infrastructure requirements to the PUC and CAISO. As Aaron kind of showed, there's currently also a statewide process where they're looking at reliability modeling and trying to develop transmission guidance and resource requirements. I think I'm gonna actually kind of double down on kind of Nidhi's point about uncertainty. I think that's really what we're seeing as kind of a key focus area. I think that we used to look at stochastic weather uncertainty and think about how our portfolio had correlations and how it was exposed to that sort of risk. But we realized really now we need to focus more on these macro uncertainties, on load growth, resource availability, emerging tech, and procurement costs. So we're looking at doing that now and thinking about our procurement, I think one of the dynamics too that CCAs have to be very cognizant of is we don't have guaranteed rate recovery, and we've got to be competitive. We've got to be able to create a resource portfolio that still allows us to provide competitive electricity rates. So we're trading that off. I think the other kind of interesting dynamic with CCAs is we don't have the T&D part of directly a direct interface, but when we're talking about affordability in California, that's most of the bill. So we're also trying to figure out how we can be good actors, even if necessarily we don't have the right financial signals, and thinking about IRP. So that might drive things like more local procurement, less dependency on state resources, trying to better align our portfolios with kind of existing infrastructure. But yeah, no, great to be here. Thank you.
So, Ryan, just a couple of things. I might just follow up with two quick questions before I go to Roger. One, how is resource adequacy different for you from, as a CCA, when you look at it, how do you look at it from a broader modeling perspective, for example?
Right. This is, a huge challenge for us. And I think the main issue is we've got a lot of regulatory uncertainty we have to deal with in our modeling. That's the Public Utilities Commission in California a couple of years ago deployed this new slice a day RA, those we're familiar with. Basically, it requires us each peak day a month, we basically have to show a portfolio of resources that meets every hour. And one of the key things there, one of the changes is, battery storage all of a sudden became just a tool to shift energy around. It didn't become, a firm resource in and of itself. Yes, that's caused a lot of challenges, and there's some inconsistencies with that in CAISO, where we also have to show that we meet requirements as a load serving entity. I think alongside that, we've got the Public Utilities Commission in California is very active at issuing procurement orders on top of this slice a day RA construct. those procurement orders thus far are still based on an ELCC framework, a marginal ELCC framework, and those marginal ELCCs are very volatile. As we've got such a large growth in battery storage procurement, we've seen ELCCs, change a lot. So from like a modeling perspective, it's really drilling with a lot of those kind of uncertainties instead of actually, we're obviously not looking at, we're trying to understand the dynamics, but we're not looking at running, servo, but the capacity expansion model itself. But we're trying to, or the production cost model, but we're trying to gear our capacity expansion model to be reflective of these RA issues. And I think when it comes down to it, what that's really shown is like the only surefire bet is clean firm. We know clean firm's going to have high ELCC. We know it's going to be treated well and slice a day. We know it's going to weather, some of these, marginal ELCC challenges. So I think that's driven a lot of interest in that. And I think also long term, as the state decarbonizes, we have an interest in reducing our reliance on natural gas RA that is currently helping us meet our slice a day. And the key challenge there is winter. So it's solar storage. It's pretty clear now how that kind of helps meet the RA challenge, although it's got some regulatory risk. But the winter part is something that we're grappling with in our resource planning.
Right. No, thanks, Ryan. So from a CCA, let's go to TVA. So Roger, I mean, you all serve, multi-state territory, extremely diverse generation mix, and you're looking at DSM in terms of like energy efficiency and demand response. So there's I can only imagine the sort of the complexity and then all the things that Nidhi and Ryan said about uncertainty that you're dealing with. So where do you see sort of like one, maybe you could in your own way explain sort of the complexity and the uncertainty that you're dealing with, and then maybe where you see are the opportunities to sort of like improve on the analytical rigor of resource planning from your perspective.
Yes. Thank you for having me. It's funny. I never thought TVA was that big and complex because I worked there for a long time. The thing that struck me, the way we deal with it is, in my career, we spent a lot of time, talking about the models underneath the big model. Like you discussed, like your reliability model and your capacity planning model. But there's a generation model in 8760 chronological. There's like a midterm model, a real-time model. And we spend a lot of our time trying to make all those models speak the same language and get the same insights so that when you go to an IRP process and you have to rely on perhaps two, the reliability model and the capacity planning model, it speaks for all of them underneath. So that's kind of how we kind of wrangle the complexity of the TVA system. And maybe an even simpler example is we have a very large hydro system that predominantly is modeled by a river forecasting group in Knoxville outside of Chattanooga. But what comes from that and what we model like is the economic dispatch of hydro does speak to the way the hydro system is actually dispatched from that office. So it's a continual process of like relying on specific models and sub processes and making sure they all like understand each other and then trying to improve each one incrementally. Like in a reliability model, we're starting to explore ELCCs. We do have ELCCs in our model. We're looking to do like a two-dimensional sort of relationship between battery and solar as we get more penetration and trying to get, again, all these models to speak the same language and have the same insights. One of the things that, I think is like really something that could really improve, everybody's process is we're just talking about uncertainty about all these different things, but not just uncertainty and like just inputs, but like how a organization makes decisions to have maybe not the most optimal plan, but a robust plan, knowing that even your long-term uncertainties are compounded by your short-term ones. And everybody's going to ask, what's the least cost plan? And I'm going to say, I could give it to you, but it will not exist because that future does not exist here. But I could probably give you a robust one. And that's something I think that really could elevate the industry. And we're trying to get our, heads around it ourselves and just kind of, because that's a computational ball of wax to eat through as well. So I think those are like the two major sort of things is like breaking into parts that are representative of the whole, and then trying to deal with our just newfound uncertainty in all elements of the planning process.
Right. No, Thanks, Roger. And maybe I'll stick with you for one follow-up question. Is that, oftentimes, at least in like stakeholder meetings, large utilities face skepticism. Like, you all have a diverse portfolio, and they struggle in the sense to understand all the complexities. So, what do you think, maybe TVA is doing or is striving towards to sort of think about maybe open source or openly documented modeling approaches? Is that something that's in sort of the thought process of TVA?
Yeah, we have talked about it, maybe not going totally open source. I'll start back from like why that is important. It elevates the conversation from, hey, you got a black box and it's just telling you what you wanted to get out of it, what you wanted to tell us anyway. So it elevates the conversation to inputs. And it's like, okay, this is a computational problem. This is how it's viewed currently in industry. We could have that discussion off the side, and we can have with our stakeholders, hey, these are the assumptions you put into that model, which we do believe. We can have that kind of conversation. So it provides a more fruitful conversation with the stakeholders. Now, open source, I would say we're more on the open inputs. We provide a lot of our inputs. A lot of our stakeholders are users of our commercial software. But I think open source and just like open code bases and stuff like that can elevate that. I do think one of the challenges in that field is these are still business sort of relationships that we have with commercial developers, and like who's on the hook for the support, and if we have like bug fixes and all that, and how's that ecosystem going to fit into like the traditional industry construct. That's a little bit of the difficulty on that one, but I could see where it can provide a lot of benefit.
Right, right. No, I mean, yeah, we certainly appreciate sort of the legacy of the systems and and the ability to sort of like, yeah, fully embrace open source. So no, I appreciate that answer. Maybe I'll come back to Aaron quickly. So Aaron, where does the rubric stand on, say, open source modeling platforms? Did you all explore that, or that wasn't really the crux of the matter in the rubric?
Yeah, the rubric was, I would to use the term agnostic to the specific approach, really trying to plant the seeds of what do we want to see, uh, irrespective of what tool we're using to see it. That said, there are a few examples of open source models that I believe are highlighted in the rubric. And I see open source models being a really valuable opportunity to be able to demonstrate, especially maybe newer or emerging best practices that haven't been maybe well established in more commercial tools, to really be able to demonstrate their value, and be able to really be able to highlight how they might be designed and what their impacts could be. So I think that there's certainly an opportunity for open source tools to be on the leading edge, I think, of some of the innovation, and then that can trickle down to proprietary tools or other planning processes.
Right. Right. Thanks, Aaron. So maybe, yeah, last question really on open source, and maybe I'll point this to Nithi. Nithi, I mean, given the fact that, we have pretty robust commercial tools available. So do you see, though, any gaps in the way that they approach to problems and that, that planners need and commercial tools because of their just the nature of them being commercial tools and their audience may not solve? And is there a place for these open source tooling to sort of fill that gap? What do you think from your standpoint?
Yeah, I mean, I definitely think that there's an important space for open source tools. EPRI is very tool agnostic. We work with open source tools, we work with our in-house tools, we work with lots of commercial tools. Our experience with the commercial vendors is that like they're pretty on top of industry needs. They're working with their client, they're working directly with the industry and their clients who are telling them what their needs are. And they have roadmaps for that development. That's our general experience with where their positions are at. What I see for the open source community is just you end up with this sheer, just massive development community, right? So it is just tapping into so much, good modeling approaches, good modeling techniques, all this brain power to tackle a lot of the emerging questions, exactly what Aaron said. So, integrated system planning. There's a lot of tools out there, again, across the different spectrum that are trying to do, aspects of integrated system planning, you know, rigorously co-optimizing across many different systems that can be challenging given sort of existing structures. When you have these open source tools and you have this massive development community, you can kind of just like take things apart really easily and put it back together. I think that's huge. I think that emerging questions around like modeling, storage and multiple, types of storage at the same time, modeling load flexibility. What we're seeing right now is that like on the very emerging questions, there tends to be most people are using like workarounds in their existing structures, right? That's fine and it's expected. And frankly, these tools are regulatorily approved. There is a space and an important space for them for all the reasons that Roger just mentioned. But when it comes to sort of moving the needle and helping, I feel like I just think that there's a really important space for open source modeling.
Yeah, no, thank you, Nidhi. So I'm actually going to pivot to a couple of great audience questions, and maybe Nidhi, you could answer the first one. Certainly, I'll open the floor to others. But the question is, do you think we should have standardized modeling software across the planning region so that utilities within a region are all using the same platform? So, any first reaction to that question? I'll ask others as well.
Yeah, that's a great question. I'll start by saying in a lot of regions, that is where things have moved. Like there are, system operators or within certain markets where where there's a, kind of a standardized software and all the stakeholders in those regions are, sometimes they're granted licenses to be able to run that, the utilities IRP and things like that. So that is the case in some cases. Um, I, I'm not sure what running the exact same model all the time would necessarily do. What I think is what the implication or what the premise of that question is, and that's what's important, which is there needs to be standardized data and assumptions and an understanding of what the scenarios are, and there needs to be enough open benchmarking so that people have a really deep insight into if something looks different, why is that the case? So I don't think we necessarily need to be moving to one single model, but I do think we need to be moving towards a common understanding of data and why models are working the way they are and why they might be different.
Yeah, yeah. Roger, I'll repeat the question. So, yeah, in case, yes. And to me, I agree with you, Nidhi, because, for example, and the question, Roger, is like, yeah, should we have standardized modeling software across the planning region? And my concern, anyways, and you could answer it any way you want, is that, for example, storage. If you have one tool that's standardized across a large region, and storage, for example, is not appropriately modeled in that one tool, then you're struggling to properly value storage, for example. But wonder what you think about that, Roger.
Yeah, even go a little earlier than that. Within a region, we tend to share from our peer group, so there's a lot of like common tools already being shared because we have a similar sort of problems. But I could think of like storage, for instance. We are looking at very large storage projects, pump storage, and we seek out tools that give us better granularity and better answers for that will suffice for other means, but are particularly developed that have good answers for our particular problem. I think like the standardization would perhaps limit the progression of the craft a little bit by kind of hamstringing us. Well, this is the standard, but this one new tool, maybe open source, commercial, proprietary, whatever, is handling in a new way. It provides like kind of like a hurdle to get it, in place versus a utility having a need for it and having a good need for it and like implementing it. So I would shy away from saying like the standardization is the appropriate answer to that one.
Yeah, no, thanks, Roger. The next question, again, maybe I'll ask Aaron first and then Ryan. Aaron, this was a really great question. It's like, if not open source tools, what are the best practices to ensuring transparency and data access for stakeholders? What are the barriers to proper engagement if full transparency can't be achieved? You want to take a stab at that?
Yeah, it's a great question, and one that I think there's some great content within the rubric and reference guide, specifically best practice number 13, which I didn't get to cover in the presentation, is on transparently and accessibly providing data tables and inputs, assumptions, as well as results. And so I think this is essential. And this is actually kind of a unique best practice on how we present it within the rubric, because we actually offer specific checklists, both checklists for what types of summary tables and outputs are the most useful and what should be, high priority to be included within an IRP. Those are resource mix tables, new resources, scenario costs, annual bill limits, and other sort of really essential assumptions and results. And then also a checklist for how the data methodologies and assumptions can be presented in a way that really maximizes transparency. So having machine readable CSV files that are clearly organized and formatted, having specific references to model versions in case there's opportunities to try and really dive into some of the modeling details on not getting caught up on versioning issues, which I've seen in some of my colleagues' work. So little steps like that can really enhance both, I think, the transparency of like what is presented and what is the output of a plan, and making that intuitive and readable and understandable, as well as steps that stakeholders that maybe want to dig a little bit deeper can do so in a way that really maximizes their accessibility there. Yeah. So in summary, yeah, I think it's really essential. And I think there are some concrete steps that can be taken that can go a really long way in maximizing that transparency and accessibility.
No, great answer. So, Ryan, I mean, you all have already explored open source tools for, your own sort of analysis, resource planning. And how do you look at it in terms of like transparency? Like this, is the CCA held to similar standards? Do ratepayers come and ask you about, your procurement, for example?
Not as much. I think, but we do sit on the other side of the table, for the PUC's process, that we're a stakeholder looking at how the PUC is modeling. And I think, totally reinforce everything Aaron just said. I think also, I think a lot of stakeholders obviously aren't sophisticated enough to do the modeling themselves in parallel. So I think one of the side benefits of the scenario best practices is that it facilitates some robust conversations with stakeholders that you don't get, when you're kind of focused on a deterministic outcome, as Roger kind of mentioned, but the black box, that I think, ultimately, if we're able to see different outputs and realizations of scenarios and talk about why the model is giving different answers and why you might want to pay more for, a more robust set of resources, and have some of those conversations out in public, I think that builds some trust and buy-in. Even if we're still dealing with proprietary tools. So I think that's something that we recognize on that side of the table. Yeah.
Yeah. Great. Thanks, Ryan. Question for you, Nidhi, actually. So it says, I'm curious about more of Nidhi's comment on decision making under uncertainty methods. Can we move beyond deterministic scenario planning entirely with stochastic or robust optimization? Your favorite topic.
I know I could spend a whole hour more on this. I love the question. I think we can. I think we can move entirely there eventually, particularly with the onset of AI and advanced computational methods. Um, I'll just give an anecdote. At EPRI, we have been doing a project with a set of our industry members um, to educate around concepts of adaptive planning. So this is like actually, utilizing formal concepts of stochastic optimization with recourse for those of you who speak that language, and showing sort of how to apply it in an IRP setting. Um, Most tools out there at the level of complexity and detail required in the to be considered like in the actual IRP are not there yet in order to run these like fully stochastic optimization problems on like real complex systems. But there are elements of that space that can be directly applied even using the tools that you currently are using. So I'm not going to name them, but we worked with one company recently where they literally took elements of like formal stochastic optimization for recourse and applied it with their deterministic modeling tool in their current IRP that they were filing, and were able to sort of like move in that direction. So I think yes. The short answer is I think we can get there sooner probably rather than later now with the onset of the computational techniques that we have. But I think that there are elements of this space that folks can even start getting into their IRPs today. There's a multitude of them. So appreciate the question.
I
Okay,
quickly
great.
want to add to this too, because this is a big priority for us in California, is specifically, and I think maybe there's a little bit more promise, at least on RO, robust optimization, to be able to apply it and make it practical. For those who haven't seen it, for instance, Zero Lab released a paper on doing this in the context of California system planning, and we see it as so vital, like to thinking about these decisions. Because I think this is maybe as intuitive as on this call, but with scenario planning, you're still assuming perfect foresight in each of those scenarios. So you still need a mechanism to think about the types of investments that could be valuable across different futures. And in California in particular, with decarbonization journey and with potentially low growth, being very cautious about affordability, it's very important to think about these kind of multi-value type opportunities. So I'm I'm rooting for it.
Thanks, Ryan. All right, well, I wanted to wrap up with one final question, and maybe I'll start with Roger first. So, Roger, IRP quality varies tremendously across our country for sure. And Aaron kind of, alluded to that, like there's good, better, best. What's in your mind the single most important change we could enable? Is it in tools? Is it in process? Is it in culture that would just improve the quality of resource planning?
Well, I thought about it a little bit, and I think for me, it's the stakeholder engagement and just the culture of just we're all being this together and we're trying to come up with a solution that's for everybody. Everybody can work on their individual modeling needs and how they represent the system, but like coming together with the stakeholders and having a robust process for in dialogue, I think is probably like step zero of creating a better process, so that even though it takes time for methods and procedures to evolve, like there's trust in the process from one end to the other. I think that's one thing I really valued at TVA in my IRP years working on them, is like we've had a lot of input and really close working with our stakeholder group. And I think that really does add to the quality of whatever comes out of that process and those models.
Thanks, Roger. Aaron, you want to go next? what do you think? You wrote the best practices rubric, so pick one.
Yeah, I think the previous question I was chatting through just about the transparency and accessibility um, really is a foundation. And if we go back to just how we started, articulate, prioritize, empower. Articulate is the first one of those steps. And I feel like being able to articulate the results of the IRP, the methodologies, and especially when we're dealing with these new best practices, being able for regulators, for stakeholders, for folks within the utility or planning department to be able to clearly identify, understand what's going on, unlocks opportunities for further improvement, both from within that planning department, from across the stakeholders that I completely agree with Roger, can offer valuable insights and cooperation through stakeholder processes, as well as trust from the regulators who are ultimately reviewing and approving these plans.
Yeah. So thanks, Aaron. Brian, tools, process, or culture? What would you, or there's something else?
Sure. No, I think I'm going to be, this is going to sound like a broken record, but I do think kind of in the context of FERC 1920 now, I think we've kind of got this now like framework for where there will be an appetite, at the ISOs, RTOs for really taking, resource planning that's done right, thinking about scenarios and, delivering transmission investments that are valuable. So I think we just really need to think about how to best feed, valuable insights into that. I think part of that is kind of stepping away from, this, deterministic look at models, making the model be the gospel of truth, and like realizing that they're conversation tools kind of to, what we've talked about, and letting us explore uncertainty and how that might guide strategic, decisions on infrastructure or resource build outs. I think it's important. That's kind of the framework we take.
Yeah, thanks, Ryan. Eddie, last word to you, and feel free to even talk about forecasting uncertainty as you think about these answers, right? I mean, resource planning sort of starts with that uncertainty that we start with. So yeah, last word.
Yeah, thanks, Nikhil. Well, yeah, it's not going to be hard for me to jump on my fellow panelists' comments in terms of uncertainty and transparency. I think that those are the key. So, I mean, even just thinking about data center load, right? Most of us think about the question as how much data center load is there going to be on the system, and that's the uncertainty. But if you actually, think about that from like the holistic perspective of all of the different agents that are involved in this industry now, there's uncertainty about, yes, of course, DC load growth, but also from the data center's perspective, will there be room for me on a grid? How fast can I connect? Will I have the materials I need from the supply chain in order to build, even if I do get the opportunity to connect? From the grid side, how much flexibility can I potentially receive from a data center that I'm allowing to connect or that I'm offering the connection to? There's questions about market signals. There's questions about incentives that utilities would provide to data centers. So there's just uncertainty from so many different directions and so many different players when it comes to data centers and load growth, that what I'll say is the more coordinated everyone can be, like everyone to the table, like Roger said, the DC developers, the hyperscalers, right? The utility system operators, technology developers, model developers, regulators, the better. And in order to facilitate that, I think it just comes down to transparency. I think it comes down to developing common languages, common tools, and multi-directional education, which is, I think what the IRP CoLab is all about. And so, yeah, just congratulations again for the public launch today and having us. But I think that's what it is.
Thank you so much, Nidhi, and thank you all on the panel. I'm impressed. We stuck to the time. We are stopping at the top of the hour. As a reminder, we have our next webinar on May 13th. We are going to talk a lot about the other deep dives and deliverables that the CoLab has been working on. I'd like to thank our RMI colleagues and GridLab team members for putting in all the hard work, and thank you all for joining.